All right, class, let's talk about Napoleon. We talked about the first part of Napoleon with our last board. Our essential question, how did Napoleon rule as an emperor, and how was this different than King Louis XVI? He was an absolute ruler. Is an emperor really that much different than an absolute ruler? So we ended with talking about Napoleon, and he started taking on a much larger role as an emperor and conducting war against other countries in Europe. The War of the Third Coalition in 1803, Napoleon began to make preparations to invade Great Britain. He knew that Great Britain was going to be a holdout. He could, lead his forces, his armies against Austria, Prussia, Italy, and in Spain, but he knew that he needed to take Great Britain. Austria signs an alliance with the British. Napoleon's conquest of Italy convinced the powers of Europe that there was a threat of the balance of power. The Battle of Trafalgar, the French and Spanish fleet destroyed by the British Navy, and Lord Horatio Nelson was the captain, the admiral at that time, that did a lot of damage to the French fleet. Now, the British Navy is supreme. The French no longer able to invade England, so obviously this was a disappointment to Napoleon. The Battle of Austerlitz, December 1805, Russian pulls her troops out of the Third Coalition, and it collapses. Austria loses a lot of land. So during the coalition, the Third Coalition, they had some teeth to fight against Napoleon, but when Russia pulled out, this whole Third Coalition collapsed, and Austria and the other coalition powers soon lost or were relegated to going home and with tails behind their legs. All right, Napoleon commissioned the Arc of Triumph in 1806, which still stands in Paris today. Prussia continued to lose. They signed the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Now, the Treaty of Tilsit, Prussia loses half its people to land ceded by France. So the land that France took was heavily populated. Russia accepts Napoleon's rule and continental rule, and we'll talk about continental rule in a second. The height of Napoleon's success. So Napoleon, at this point, ruled almost all of Europe and was sitting pretty. He consolidated many German independent states. The Holy Roman Empire was abolished. German nationalism awoke due to France's domination. So remember, you had 300 independent German states. They were, working with a prince here and a prince there, supposedly all under the auspices of the Holy Roman Empire. But once that was abolished, things began to change. Napoleon tried to bring them all together under one control, and this actually ignited a German nationalist movement, which was not good for Napoleon. Now, the continental system, Napoleon tries to wage economic warfare against Britain after its losses. The Berlin Decree of 1806, Napoleon closed ports on European continent to the British. So the British were not able to send their ships to do any kind of trading with European, mainland European continent ports. British issue the Order of Council to try to, in direct response to the Berlin Decree. And the Order in Council, neutral ships must stop in Great Britain. So if you're a neutral ship, not a French ship, before you were to go to the continent of Europe, like if you were coming from America, first you had to stop at Britain, and then you could go to France, or you could go to Germany or some other place. This did not sit well with the French. Now, eventually, the War of 1812 that took place in the United States between the British and the U.S. over shipping rights was, largely due to this conflict and the passage of the Order of Council. Now, the continental system ultimately was a failure. It did not interrupt enough of the British shipping to mainland continental Europe to be effective. Now, the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814, the peninsula, they're talking about Spain and Portugal. The first great revolt against Napoleon occurred in Spain. It waged a guerrilla warfare against Napoleon's forces. During this time, Napoleon got married. He marries an 18-year-old Marie Louise, who was the niece of Marie Antoinette. Remember, she was from Austria, daughter of the Austrian emperor. And at this point, Napoleon starts to give more consideration to the French nobles. The Russian campaign of 1812, Napoleon invades Russia, not a very wise move, but he wanted to take Russia, with an army of 600,000 in June of 1812. Napoleon overextends his forces, the Battle of Bordonio, After a 5-week siege of Moscow, Napoleon forced to retreat. Essentially, he was defeated. Lost over 400,000 men. Now, some of these forces had come from Prussia, some from Austria, some from Italy. So his forces were more of an international force rather than all French. Nevertheless, to lose 400,000 men, that's a lot of men. The Russians took 100,000 prisoners, and only 30,000 men were able to return to their homeland, whether it be Prussia, Austria, or France, or whatever. The War of the Fourth Coalition. So once the Russian campaign put a dent into the French military, the War of the Fourth Coalition, after losing Russia, Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia, align against France. So after the defeat, the Russians defeat the French, this Fourth Coalition forms up, and they really start taking it to the French and Napoleon. The Battle of Leipzig, October 1813, Napoleon loses another 500,000 from his Grand Army. And remember, he had a very large army. People were forced into conscription into the army. It was like the draft. All men had to serve. So had a very, very large army, but nevertheless not large enough. Napoleon refuses to accept the terms of the Frankfurt proposals, reducing the size of France. Essentially, he had lost the war, and they were, giving Napoleon the terms, and he refused them. Napoleon abdicated as emperor in April of 1814 when the Allied armies actually entered Paris. He knew that his emperor days were over. Now, the monarchy was thus restored. The House of Bourbon, King Louis the 16th was the last one. The House of Bourbon restored to the throne. King Louis the 18th was brought back to the throne. So this would have been the grandson of the last king of France, who got his head chopped off. Now, the Charter of 1814, King created a two-house legislature. Restoration maintained most of Napoleon's reforms and code. So there were some great ideas that Napoleon put forth that remained in France. Now, the Congress of Vienna in September of 1814, June 1815, reps from major powers meet to try to restore old regime, and not just talking about France now, we're talking about all throughout Europe. The ideas of the revolution had transferred to these different countries when the French had spread, and now these ideas were being called into question, and they wanted to restore the old regime in a lot of these places. Clemens von Metternich represented Austria at the Congress of Vienna, and he was very conservative. And we're going to hear a lot more about Metternich because of his conservative nature and the way that he helped build up Austria and Europe. Congress moved to return to the power of the old regime of families, balance of power, country borders, reset. They kind of encircle France to make sure that they never rise to power again. So they're really trying to take French power away from them. The land that the French had taken during the war, they gave back to Austria, they gave back to Germany, Italy, and they really hemmed in France. Napoleon is sent to Elba, an island in the Mediterranean. So they send him down there. They say, get the heck out of France. Now, the 100 days, March of 1815 to June of 1815, Napoleon leaves Elba and meets his army in southern France. And his army was very sympathetic to Napoleon. They knew that he was a very powerful, leader. So they meet him in southern France, and then they all get together and they march.
Attention all advisement team
Paris.
members, could you please call 2209? Advisement team members, please call 2209.
And there's the announcements. Okay, last board. Napoleon has widespread support and seized power from King Louis XVIII. He raises an army and defeats the Prussians. So immediately he's going back to war to get that land that was taken from him. The Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, Napoleon is defeated by Belgium, Prussian and English forces led by the Duke of Wellington. And it was the English that really put the pressure on now. Napoleon sent to St. Helena, an island in the South Atlantic off the coast of Africa. So instead of just sending him to the Mediterranean where he might be able to hop on a ship and head back to France, now they sent him all the way down to the South Atlantic, in the southern hemisphere. France is condemned for supporting Napoleon and dealt with strictly by other countries. So the Treaty of Paris in 1815, some more loss of land, and they had to pay reparations for loss of life. So France is really ostracized and condemned due to Napoleon's actions. All right, remember, history's no mystery. Take good notes.